Hey everyone, welcome back to Engelbard Gaming. Today I've got another 11 facts video for you, and this time I'll be talking about the Atari Jaguar. You probably think I'm going to have an unnecessarily long preamble here, where I drone on about a bunch of inane things that have nothing to do with anything. Well, if you think that, well, you're wrong! I'll just tell you that I've had a Jaguar since the system launched way back in 1993, so you know I'm not just a hater piling on Atari with some of the things I'm going to discuss here. There are some games I actually like on the system, and well, let's save the rest for the facts. Let's get on with it. Atari's claim in marketing that the Jaguar was a 64-bit system was dubious at best. Yes, this one is controversial even today, roughly 30 years after the launch of the system. But let's take a quick look at the Jaguar architecture and see what you think afterwards. The Jaguar had multiple processors, but there are three primary chips on which they were found: a 16-bit Motorola 68000 and two custom 32-bit RISC chips named Tom and Jerry. Remember, RISC stands for Reduced Instruction Set Computer, or chips, and they basically had fewer instructions for the CPU, but they executed them faster. Now, the Motorola 68000, which was found in loads of arcade boards, the Genesis/Mega Drive, the Amiga, the Atari ST, and many other systems, boots the Jaguar and runs its general startup routines, and was supposed to be there to manage input and some other mundane functions. Tom is primarily the graphics chip containing things like the blitter. If you're wondering what a blitter is, in some machines from this era, blitters assisted with processing graphics that needed to move quickly around the screen without having to rely on hardware sprites. The blitter is technically 64-bit. There's also an object processor that's part of the Tom chip that is also 64-bit. The Jerry chip could be used to assist in graphics processing, but was primarily supposed to handle sound for the Jaguar. While it seems most games did use it for sound, some actually did use it to assist in graphics processing, perhaps most famously in the Jaguar port of Doom, which we'll get to shortly. Finally, there's the fact that Tom has 64 pins and runs on a 64-bit data bus. What's a bus in computing? We'll simplify the super technical definitions of what a bus is as this. A bus is basically a group of wires that connects things like a processor and RAM. The more wires or lanes that a bus has, the more information you can send over it at once. So is all of this enough to just settle the argument and say the Jaguar is a 64-bit system? Well, at best, the Jaguar has a few 64-bit components. And Atari was kind of mocked during the Jaguar's lifetime by magazines like Electronic Gaming Monthly, or EGM, who had said that if Sega measured things the way Atari did, the Saturn would be a 112-bit system. Sega tried to engage in some of their own bit shenanigans with the Saturn, but quickly backed off. And you can find the story about that in my 11 facts about the Saturn you maybe didn't know. One last piece of info worth mentioning for this segment is that since Tom and Jerry are 32-bit processors, they only accept up to 32-bit instructions. Depending on the circumstances, there can be two 32-bit instructions processed in parallel, but that doesn't equal 64-bit. In the end, I don't think you can really consider the Jaguar a 64-bit system. Even one of the principal engineers of the Jaguar, John Matheson, tried to hedge by saying that the system is, quote, 64-bit where it counts, an admission that it's actually not a 64-bit system if ever there was one. So unless you want to start calling modern PCs with 64-bit CPUs and 192-plus-bit GPUs 192-plus-bit systems, which nobody does, I don't think we should call the Jaguar 64-bit either. The Jaguar was Atari's first big cat-named home console, but it wasn't supposed to be. Okay, I know a lot of you probably know this one, but it's worth covering for the sake of completeness here, and I'll keep it short. Atari's last home console before the Jaguar was the Atari 7800, which had been designed way back in 1983, and due to various reasons was not released until 1986. Atari released the Lynx in 1989, but that's not a home console, it's a portable system. As far as home systems go, Atari skipped the 16-bit era altogether, but decided to jump back into the fray with a new 32-bit system called the Panther that was to be designed by a UK-based company called Flare Technology. Flare had previously worked on the ill-fated and never-released Konix multi-system. According to the reports, Atari had started work on the Panther as early as 1988, although it seems Flare wasn't involved until 1989, and the intention was that Atari would release the system in 1991, which is the same year that the SNES was released in the United States. The main CPU of the unit was supposed to be a Motorola 68000, which is regarded as a 16-bit processor despite some internal 32-bit architecture, but the Panther was still said to be a 32-bit system. How come? Well, details are a little sketchy, but apparently it would have had a 32-bit graphics processor that handled objects like sprites and allowed for fancy effects like sprite scaling, but not sprite rotation. So what exactly happened? Why was the Panther cancelled? There were apparently a lot of problems with the hardware, and I mean a lot. Serious stuff like frequent crashes and static in the video output of the system. There's a great site that's compiled a lot of information into one place on the Panther, and I recommend giving it a look. I'll show it on the screen, but you can also find a link in the description. And after the cancellation of the Panther, Atari stuck with flair and put them to work on the thing that would become the Jaguar instead. The Jaguar was originally manufactured and distributed by IBM.
IBM, happy men, smiling all the way, in his service to mankind, that's why we are so gay.
Hey! Yes, that IBM, International Business Machines, also known as Big Blue, actually built and distributed the Atari Jaguar console. IBM signed a $500 million contract with Atari to put Jaguars together, test them, package them, and distribute them. The Jaguar units were assembled in North Carolina at IBM's plant in that state, and marked the very first time that IBM had ever made a consumer product for an external company. But if you know your gaming history, it sure wouldn't be the last. Now, if you've ever had a Jaguar, the thing feels a little, shall we say, delicate compared to the other consoles available at the time, and is surprisingly light. Knowing that the system came from such a heavy hitter with such deep pockets, I would have expected it to be a bit more substantial than it is. Now, you may have noticed that I said the Jaguar was originally manufactured and distributed by IBM. That's because after a while, another company also manufactured Jaguar units. And that company was Comptronics, located in Colorado Springs, Colorado. And they got into the Jaguar business in 1994. Comptronics was also somewhat famous at the time, but not for a positive reason. You see, the company fired its CEO in 1992, who had been mired in scandal after illegally inflating the company's profits for over 3 years. The Jaguar had only 63 official contemporary games, 50 cartridges, and 13 CD-ROM titles. The Jaguar was not blessed with a large software library. I also think that any reasonable person has to admit that the percentage of really good games on the system is pretty low. Sure, we have well-made games like Tempest 2000, Iron Soldier, Super Burnout, Wolfenstein 3D, Rayman, and some others. But then you've got loads of garbage like Club Drive, Checkered Flag, Fight for Life, and bland ports of 16-bit titles that barely look any different than the average SNES game of the era. And just why did so many of the titles on the system look like 16-bit games? Well, that Motorola 68000 that was supposed to be used for simple tasks like booting the system and reading inputs, some developers used it as the main CPU of the system, meaning it drove their entire game code. The 68000 in the Jaguar was never intended to do that. But because some developers were familiar with the 68000, they used it as a crutch instead of learning how to program for the custom Tom and Jerry chips. Anyway, I don't want to stray too far from the fact here. The Jaguar had an incredibly small library for a system that was available commercially for about 3 years, from late 93 to sometime in 1996. It's not the worst console library out there, but it ain't great overall. As with any system, there were a lot of announced games that never came out. The majority seemed to be ports of games that were originally designed for the Amiga, Atari ST, or Windows/DOS-based computers. I don't think a port of James Pond 3, T-Mech, Return to Zork, or Battle Chess would have changed the fortunes of the system. Now, one thing I will mention here is that even today, the Jaguar has a thriving homebrew development community. A lot of newer aftermarket games made for the system are ports of Atari ST titles, but there are other more interesting games for it too, like the recently announced homebrew port of Mortal Kombat. Now there's a game series that the Jag could have used back when it was new and on the market. Anyway, as I record this, there are almost 200 aftermarket, unlicensed, or homebrew games available for the Jaguar, which is about quadruple the amount of official releases. And the count just keeps going up. The Jaguar port of Doom served as the basis for nearly all of the other console ports. Doom was popular when it came out. Like, really insanely popular. It's one of those phenomena games that's really hard to convey to people that weren't yet there, meaning they hadn't been born at the time it came out. Some video games were just cultural events. Pac-Man, Street Fighter 2, Mortal Kombat 2, and Doom would all pretty much fall into that category. The Jaguar version of Doom was the first console version to begin development, and most of the engine was programmed by John Carmack. Oddly enough, the 32X version of Doom, which is based on this Jaguar version, beat it to market, coming out months before it. The Jaguar version of Doom graphically was pretty great for the time it came out. It was the first version of Doom that I ever played from start to finish. The controls are a little stiff and the frame rate isn't the best, but as far as console ports of Doom from back in the day go, the Jag version was pretty impressive, except for one thing. It had no in-game music. Well, that's not entirely true. It played the level music during the stat screen that showed up after you completed a level, but there was no music during the actual gameplay. And some of this music that you hear on the stat screen is pretty decent, but during gameplay itself, all you get is sound effects, which is a huge bummer. As I mentioned earlier, this situation came from the Jerry chip that is normally used to handle the sound and music in games, being used to help the Tom chip render the graphics this time around. What other versions of Doom were based on this initial Jaguar port? Well, the 32X version, the 3DO version, the PlayStation version, technically the Saturn version, which was a port of that PlayStation version, and also the Game Boy Advance version. They sure got a lot of mileage out of this one port of Doom, didn't they? Some fans have been working on enhancing the Jaguar port of Doom by getting the music to play during gameplay. However, the latest version I've seen of that, it still has a lot of audio issues and glitches. But maybe it won't be too long before we see a fully functioning Jaguar version of Doom with music and sound effects during gameplay. Atari released a 6-button Pro controller late in the Jaguar's life. Kind of. I can't stress enough how god-awful the standard Atari Jaguar controller is. The overly stiff and low directional pad is just a nightmare to use and actually caused me pain even when I was young. The whole thing felt way too light and plasticky, it was in no way satisfying to use, and that size definitely too big. The shape itself was kind of okay, I guess, but the gimmicky keypad may have seemed like a good idea on paper, but in reality it has soft rubbery buttons that are kind of hard to press during fast gameplay. This is one of my least favorite first-party controllers for any system ever made. A bit later on in the Jaguar's short commercial lifespan, Atari released an updated version of the controller that gave it the 6 action buttons it should have probably had to begin with, along with 2 shoulder buttons. But like so many things in life, there's a bit of a catch. The X, Y, and Z buttons just duplicate the 9, 8, and 7 keys on the numeric keypad, while the L and R buttons duplicate the 4 and 6 buttons from the numeric keypad. Now I get that Atari was trying to do something different with the original Jaguar controller and harken back to older systems like the Atari 5200, ColecoVision, and Intellivision, but as I see it, there was a reason that design didn't continue past the early era of gaming. The keypads were never comfortable to use on those older systems, and neither is the one on the Jaguar. I don't think most people avoided the Jaguar just because of the controller, but the controller being so terrible definitely didn't help things. The updated Pro controller with its 6 face buttons and 2 shoulder buttons was just too little too late to really have any impact, and it didn't fully address the shortcomings of the original design. The Atari Jaguar system case had an odd journey ending up in strange places. Okay, this is another fact you probably already know, but it's too weird not to discuss in this video, so here it is. This is, of course, an Atari Jaguar. As gamers, we all know what this thing looks like, especially those of us that have owned it from the start. The Jaguar didn't have much of a retail shelf life and died a quick commercial death. But the outer case of the Jaguar? The case lived on, my retro gaming friends. What you're looking at now is not a Jaguar, this is the Hot Rod from Imagine, with no E at the end, Systems Corporation. Or maybe it's Imogen, I don't know. We'll go with Imagine. Seems a little familiar, doesn't it? Yep, this thing is the Jaguar shell, but it is actually a dental imaging system. Imagine Systems, again no E at the end, ended up owning the molds for the Atari Jaguar system, Jaguar CD, and even the cartridges, but not the controllers. The Hot Rod was used to take pictures of the inside of people's mouths. Engineer Stephen Mortensen bought the molds for a relative pittance after Atari's demise. What I love most about this is they were going to have an optional storage unit for images. Can you guess what that would have been? Yep, a Jaguar cartridge-shaped memory unit that was to go inside the cartridge slot of the thing. The Hot Rod unfortunately didn't have much of a shelf life itself, since it was an analog camera system at a time when everything was moving to digital. Now, that would have been a weird enough story in and of itself, but it's not where the story of the Jaguar casing ends. Oh no, folks, this one ends in tears. Well, maybe not tears, but some infamous retro gaming controversy, which is almost as good. Do any of you know of a would-be system that ended up being complete vaporware known as the Coleco Chameleon? It's a long story worth telling in its own video at some point. But to sum it all up, a man on the media side of the gaming industry named Mike Kennedy tried to crowdfund a brand new retro gaming console way back in 2015. It failed, but he ended up partnering with Hasbro, who owned the Coleco brand. They purchased the molds from Imagine to use the Jaguar case as the shell for the new system, now dubbed the Coleco Chameleon. They showed off a prototype of the system at an event in New York and planned to launch a Kickstarter to finish funding it. But let me slow down. Did they really show a prototype? You see, Kennedy and/or those involved showed a picture of the Chameleon with a clear plastic case, and you could see the system board right through the Jaguar-shaped shell. The internet did its thing and figured out what was inside the case was nothing more than a video capture card. And right after that, well, the whole thing famously fell apart, and there were doubts that any actual hardware for the Chameleon ever existed at all. The Chameleon, as a product, was soon after cancelled, and Hasbro cut ties with Kennedy. The well-traveled Jaguar case has yet to turn up in any other projects since then, at least as of early May 2024 as I record this. The Jaguar CD was supposed to have extended capabilities. Ah, the Jaguar CD. Perhaps it was most famous for its resemblance to a toilet bowl, as was often gleefully pointed out in both gaming magazines and on the internet way back in the day. While the Jaguar base console itself reportedly moved a total of 150,000 units, the CD add-on, which was released in 1995, reportedly only saw total worldwide sales of 20,000 units. It was discontinued just a year later in 1996, and anecdotal evidence out there suggests that a pretty large percentage of them no longer work due to fairly shoddy materials and assembly, but I don't have any empirical evidence that fully covers failure rates, so take that with a grain of salt. Now, what did the Jaguar CD with its double-speed reader add to the main console? Well, the larger storage capacity of CDs, of course, the ability to play back Redbook audio, the ability to play CD plus G titles, and some other stuff. It also included an app called the VLM, or Virtual Light Machine, that was designed by Jeff Minter, who you may know as the man behind several classic games, including Tempest 2000. Jaguar CD games used a proprietary format that was based on audio CDs instead of standard CD-ROMs, that led to higher disk capacities. They could store up to about 790 megabytes versus the normal 650 to 700 megabytes of other devices, and was meant to combat piracy as well. Originally, however, it appears the plans for the CD add-on had been a little more ambitious. Word through the grapevine, both at the time and out on the old internets these days, said that Atari had plans to release add-ons for the add-on. They wanted to release a hardware MPEG decoder that would have included extra RAM and a Kodak photo CD add-on cartridge for, you guessed it, access to photo CDs. There were other possible add-on cartridges mentioned, but those are the two that almost everyone seems to agree were most strongly considered for production. In the end, none of these add-ons for the add-on were ever released. Not exactly shocking, considering the very low sales of the unit. A former member of Sega's AM2 who worked on the original Virtua Fighter also worked on Fight for Life. Fight for Life is known for two things. It was the final commercial Jaguar release from Atari themselves, and it was god-awful. 3D fighting games had become all the rage thanks to Virtua Fighter and Tekken. Atari wisely decided that a 3D fighting game on their system could really be a boon. So, what happened? Atari recruited Francois-Yves Bertrand, who had previously worked for Sega's superstar team over at AM2 on the camera and collision detection for the first Virtua Fighter. Bertrand had spent a couple of years working for AM2 before moving to the US and offering his services to both 3DO and Atari. It was Atari that snapped him up and put him to work as the sole programmer on this 3D disaster, Fight for Life. You may know the internet lore around this, that Atari released an incomplete version of the game because Bertrand said Atari stopped paying him, so he withheld the final version. Often the battle cry was that the final version was a good game, and it's a shame we didn't get that final version. If only we had gotten it. Hell, I'm sure the reality is that the final game wasn't much better, if any better, than what Atari actually released. The controls in this game are beyond terrible. They're slow, unresponsive, and completely hamper the gameplay. The graphics were pretty pathetic by the time it came out, and the sound and music weren't exactly anything to write home about either. The one really innovative thing about this game is also one of its most annoying factors. You start out with almost no special moves, and you have the ability to claim moves from defeated fighters in the one-player mode. In the end though, this is probably the worst 3D fighting game that I've ever played. For his part, Bertrand later said that he enjoyed working with the Jaguar hardware. Well, at least someone had fun with Fight for Life. The Jaguar's successor was pretty far along in development when Atari pulled the plug on both it and the original system. Despite the Jag's retail woes during its short lifetime, Atari was plugging away the development of the console that was to succeed it. I don't know what the official codename really was, a few were rumored, so for this video we'll just call it the Jaguar 2. What was the Jaguar 2 going to be like? There are a lot of rumored specs out there, but I'm going to tell you about the ones that I find the most believable and seem to be the most corroborated. I'll have links in the description to where I got this information from. The overall design concept of the Jaguar 2 would have apparently been pretty similar to the original Jaguar, but the three major chips would have been upgraded significantly. The Motorola 68000 would have been replaced with a Motorola 68EC020 processor, and the Tom and Jerry chips would have been replaced by two chips named Oberon and Puck for characters from the classic Shakespeare play A Midsummer Night's Dream. Fans of the excellent Disney animated series Gargoyles will also find those names familiar. And once again, take all of this with a grain of salt, but the scuttlebutt was that Oberon was the graphics chip and would have essentially been a combination of 5 processors. Components of Oberon would have been able to handle 128-bit instructions and would have been pretty powerful, allowing for up to 900,000 texture-mapped polygons. The Puck chip would have been 32-bit and mimicked the functions of Jerry in the original Jaguar, meaning that it was primarily designed as a sound processor, but would be able to do other things as well. The Motorola 68EC020 would have apparently run at 26.6 MHz, which would have been on par for 32-bit processors from that era. And the 68EC020 was of course a 32-bit processor. So what might the Jaguar 2 have been like if it were released with this hardware? I expect power-wise, in terms of real-world performance, this spec would have probably been a notch or two below the Dreamcast, and a few notches above the N64. The Jaguar 2 would have been an even more complicated device to come to grips with than the original, featuring 7 processors running in parallel instead of 5, and developers had already struggled to make the most of the original Jag hardware. In the end, I think it's fair to expect that the Jaguar 2 would have been reasonably powerful hardware that was rarely taken advantage of. Still, I would have liked to have seen this system in action, so it's too bad the Jag didn't do well enough for its successor to see the light of day. Oh well, what can you do? The most valuable Jaguar cartridge as of May 2024 is Battlesphere. Okay, I've been ending these lately with what the most expensive game for the system is, so why break tradition now? The most expensive Jaguar game out there right now is Battlesphere, a release that came along in the year 2000, well after the primary commercial lifetime of the system. It was manufactured in pretty limited quantities, but it's unclear exactly how many were actually made. The game had a long development cycle, first envisioned way back in 1993. The small team began work on it in 1995, and it would be another 5 years before it was completed and published. How much does Battlesphere go for in very late spring 2024 as I record this? Well, if you can find an ultra-rare new in-box copy, that'll set you back $2,500. But if you want a real bargain, just look for a complete in-box copy instead, which goes for a mere $1,250, a savings of a whopping 50%. Now, if you're the thrifty type, you can track down a loose copy of the cartridge for a mere pittance of only $830. Yeah, Battlesphere is a pricey game, no doubt about it. But hey, this is what collecting rare classic games costs in today's market. So if you want to splurge and get the most expensive Jaguar game that exists right now, here it is. Alrighty, there were 11 facts about the Jaguar with a tiny bit of speculation tossed in for good measure. As I mentioned earlier, I've had the system since right when it launched, and it had one of the most disappointing runs of any system out there. The Jaguar's lack of financial success really wasn't a surprise. Atari management at the time, led by Sam Trammell, just didn't know the business well, and they proved that time and time again. I mean, they actually let themselves be convinced by a producer that Fight for Life was going to redefine the fighting genre. Now, I don't think the Jaguar hardware itself is actually all that bad. I think it was capable of producing some pretty well-made games that were a nice step above the 16-bit titles of the time. And in a few scenarios, it challenged the PlayStation and Saturn pretty well. But really, the PlayStation and Saturn in general, when we're talking about games in the same genre, usually destroy the Jaguar in terms of quality and performance. But there are, of course, exceptions. Saturn Doom. And I do also have to admit, there are a few Jaguar games that I fully acknowledge are bad, but I can't help liking them. One such game is Kasumi Ninja. A friend and I used to play it back in its heyday, and man do we have some laughs with that one. It even looked pretty good. Now, I definitely find the post-commercial life of the system very interesting. For a system that sold so poorly, it's had a lot of interest in the decades since it was officially killed off. It has a fierce fandom that will defend it to the death, which I really don't get. But hey, there's still a good amount of people out there that really like the thing, and that's fine. In the end, the Jag was an interesting piece of technology that did things differently from a lot of other systems, and I wish we'd gotten to see more games on it from bigger companies. Anyway, what about you? Did you have a Jaguar during its commercial lifetime? Do you love the system? Do you hate it? Was anything in this video news to you? Tell me all about it in the comments. And that'll do it for this video, my retro gaming friends. If you enjoyed it, please like it and share it online somewhere. If you haven't yet, please subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you'll never miss one of my videos. If you want to support the work that I do here, you can do that on Patreon, Ko-fi, or right here on YouTube through channel memberships. With that, I'll say thanks for watching, and see me later.